Right, I think we'll begin this evening. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Alison Otter and I'm the director of the Society. And I'm very pleased actually to welcome Andrew here tonight to celebrate the publication of his book on the Alcock album. And they really are, it's absolutely beautifully produced. I'm sure that many of you have had a chance to look at it. And of course, this is the story of Henrietta and Rutherford Alcock and their time spent, well, he was British Consul in the several of the Chinese treaty ports. And it gives us a very full view of expat life, I think, through basically Henrietta's letters. And I must admit, I was quite, you know, we forget so much nowadays how life is very difficult, how life was very difficult for people living out there. I mean, just on the trip to China, Andrew mentions that she had to bring vast amounts of underwear and clothing because there are no washing facilities on board. So you can imagine, I mean, how many weeks that was and how many trunks of dirty washing that came off with you. And the other thing is, you know, a lot of the houses they lived in were very shabby and needed a lot of work when they arrived. One had 52 rooms and, you know, it's making the best of it. And you see all these aspects in the really quite exquisite watercolours in the book, which has a very peaceful, tranquil look to it. But you get this feeling that with all the other things going on in her letters, I mean, she'd, of course, plenty of time for letter writing. You know, life must have been a little bit difficult at times. And of course, she died, I think, at 41. Yeah. And nobody, there's no real cause of death, was there? And she's buried in Highgate Cemetery. Oh. So
spoiler alert.
Oh, sorry. No, I mean, this has a resonance with me because a very close friend is a guide at Highgate. Right. So I told her about it, and I wanted to show her to show me the grave the next time we go. And of course, he lived till he was 92. So I wonder if she bore the brunt of life while he got on very merrily with it. Anyway, we're really looking forward to hearing about it. And thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alison, for that introduction. It's amazing how quickly she seems to have got through the entire book, including spoiling my most exciting part of the talk when I tell you that she is buried in Highgate Cemetery, but you're not supposed to know that at the beginning of the talk, but we'll come, we'll come to that. And thank you to the Royal Asiatic Society for very generously hosting this evening. And it's very good to see all of you here. And I think there are a number of people on Zoom who I can't see, but it's very good to know that they're also listening in. For some of you, this launch has been a long time coming because there was no launch for my first two books. And so in some ways, this is a launch for all three books, although you're not expected to buy all three today. But it does give me a chance of at least saying some thanks to the people involved in the first two books. First of all, Paul Norbury, who can't be here today, but who, through his firm, Renaissance Books, published my first book, which was Mediating Empire, which built on my PhD thesis and looked at 4 generations of the Hillier Medhurst families in China and Hong Kong, and looking at family as a driver of empire. That book came out in the depths of the pandemic, but I can't necessarily say that's the reason it hasn't been a bestseller, but nonetheless, everybody's impressed by the nice light blue cover and design that it has, with a picture of my great-great-grandfather, Harry Hillier, alongside various officials. In that connection, I should mention Jim Hoare, who's skulking at the back of the room there, and who introduced me to Paul Norbury. By an extraordinary coincidence, Jim and Susan moved into the flat below us in Clapham in 1976. And almost immediately, Jim cottoned on to the fact that my forebears had been in China and started telling me I had to start researching their lives. And Jim has been a tremendous supporter and encourager right from the outset. For my second book, I have to thank Abby Lee Manthe at the City University of Hong Kong Press. My Dearest Martha was based on some 60 letters written by my great-great-grandmother, Eliza Hillier, between 1846 and 1856, from Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Bangkok, where sadly her husband died aged 36, leaving her aged 28 with 4 children and 1 more on the way, a typical story of colonial life. I always remember Abby Manthe reading the first draft of that book and saying, she'd read it on the long-haul flight to the States, and she told me that by the end of it, she had developed an intimate relationship with Eliza, and she guided that book through, and it was published in 2021. By that time, I'd come across the Alcock album, and it was vaguely thinking of perhaps being able to produce something, although I thought it would be very unlikely any publisher would be interested. So I thought I would start this evening by explaining how I came across the album, and then how I came to write the book, and finally why Henrietta is important and why you should buy the book. How I came to write the book is important because it shows what a collaborative project this book was, and the number of people whose help has been invaluable and without which the book would never have seen the light of day. But it's also a way of showing how luck can play a key role when you're researching the life of somebody about whom almost nothing seems to be known. And certainly, it was entirely due to luck that I first came across the album. The shame about this is that Martin Gregory, who's sitting here with his phone going off, is the first person I'm about to mention. It was sometime in 2018 when I was writing Mediating Empire and looking at the Hillier wives, a number of whom were married to China consuls. And I was trying to find out a bit about the lives of the wives of China consuls, but there seemed to be very little written about them. I should say that it was Geraldine, my wife, who's somewhere here, who right from the start of my PhD said I should concentrate on the women. And she turned out to be absolutely right, because when Professor John Darwin examined me for my PhD thesis, he said it was the women who were by far the most interesting part of the story. So it was in the light of that that I've been concentrating on them, certainly since Mediating Empire. But I found that there was very little known about these women. But I did notice that the Martin Gregory Gallery, which was the gallery for China Coast paintings, and unfortunately, sadly, left its premises, but is still in existence. But they had had wonderful sales of China Coast paintings, and I noticed that they had sold 2 paintings by Henrietta, the wife of Rutherford Alcock, whom I did know about, and because he knew the Hilliers in China well. Here we see him not long after his marriage to Henrietta. I think he looks somewhat supercilious, slightly arrogant, and that's certainly what he turned out to be. According to, this comes from Alexander Mitch's biography, a 2-volume biography. And according to that biography, Henrietta and Rutherford had been married for some 3 years when he was appointed a consul, and they set off for China in 1844. The First Opium War had ended 2 years before, and Alcock was one of 5 consuls who were appointed to the treaty ports, where Westerners were permitted to reside and trade, subject to the jurisdiction of their own consul. Even at that time, many in Britain saw the First Opium War as an act of unjustified aggression against China, occurring simply because China was insistent on stopping the opium trade and the importing of opium by British merchants from India. Whatever view Alcock took at the outset of the war, he was happy to be in the vanguard of the consuls who then went out to open up China, as it was called. And Henrietta really had no choice, but probably agreed with him. In the 2-volume biography, Mitchie devoted just 2 sentences to the Alcock's marriage. The first one told the reader that the marriage was congenial, and the second one that the marriage was cut short when Alcock's helpmeet, as he called Henrietta, was torn from his side 9 years later when she was just 40. As he said, Alcock's external demeanor remained unruffled. But in fact, what he didn't tell the reader was Alcock was absolutely shattered by the loss of Henrietta. She was buried, and this was why you can see why I say that Alison has spoiled the whole story. Sorry, Alison, don't worry, because she was buried in the Shantung Road Cemetery. And this grave, you'll see the caption, grave of Mrs. Alcock, who died in 1853. This photograph is in a book which came out, I think, in the 1950s, a book about the Shanghai Cemetery. And certainly, as it appeared from that book, this was still where Henrietta Alcock's remains were lying. This grave and all the graves remained in existence until the 60s, when eventually, during the Cultural Revolution, the cemetery was desecrated. But save for saying that the Alcocks had no children, that was it. Mitchie didn't even mention that Henrietta's pictures, some of them, formed illustrations in the biography. So I was intrigued to find out more about the 2 pictures which Martin had sold, and asked him whether he knew where they were. He said he wasn't sure, but he said in his characteristic throwaway manner, you do realize that we have an album of Henrietta's downstairs. I said, no, I certainly didn't realize that. He said, I'll see if I can find it. There was rather a delay because downstairs was a treasure trove of many, many paintings. But eventually he returned upstairs with the album, measuring about 10 by 13 inches, about 2 or 3 inches thick. And he said, well, there it is. I opened it, and I can remember very well opening it at this picture. You'll see the caption, British Consul at Consular, Amoy, 1844. These captions were put on quite a bit later, in the 19th century, but quite a bit later. But this obviously told me what it was of. Consular, the Amoy, which is now called Xiamen, is about 2 days sea journey up from Hong Kong. And Consular was a small island adjoining Amoy, to which the British had effectively retired, or where they'd set themselves up, because there was still a garrison of British forces in Xiamen or Amoy, which remained there pending the payment of a very substantial debt indemnity, which the British had imposed on each of the treaty ports. This, of course, had produced enormous resentment. So the Chinese had all left this small island, and Alcock's immediate predecessor had set up in the building that we see here, and he moved in with Henrietta. We've got to remember that there were no photographs at this time. The camera had literally just been started. So this was an extraordinary picture to see. Nobody had any idea what the consulates looked like. Although it looks reasonably idyllic, it was extremely dilapidated, leaked, and also vulnerable to pirates attacking, as you see. So it was a very difficult place for Henrietta to start her life as a consular wife. So I flicked on through the album. The next one I remember seeing, the British Consulate before alterations in Fuzhou, April 1846. In fact, that date incorrectly transcribes the date on the picture, which is 1845. So the Alcocks moved on after 6 months in Xiamen to Fuzhou, where they spent 18 months. And this shows the building that they moved into, although when they moved into it, it consisted only of 2 habitable rooms. It was an old Chinese temple, which they had been allowed to move into, but requiring substantial refurbishment before it was really habitable at all. And Henrietta did many pictures of the building and of the work of repair. Here we see one of the reception hall following year. You can see Chinese servants, an ornamental urn, and certainly an attractive picture. And then we're flicking on through the album again. I was just getting an idea of what was there. Here we have a view from the consulate in Shanghai. This would have been done in about 1849. They had moved to Shanghai in 1846, but spent the first 3 years in the Chinese city in the 52-room building, which Alison referred to. Again, was very dilapidated. Then they moved out eventually to a building. By 1849, the Western settlement was taking shape. And you can see here what was called the compradoric style of architecture, with verandas and pillars, not totally unlike the sort of architecture which could be found in India in the Raj. And you can see looking down here towards the river, pictures of what will have been mainly, you can see the masts of the Western ships. So that gives you an idea of the first pictures I saw. And I was completely bowled over. And I said to Martin, without any idea what I could do with the album, there must be a book here. And Martin smiled and said, well, if you think so, go ahead. And just to make it clear, he has allowed me to use all these pictures very generously without exacting any fee at all. So it's been a tremendous privilege to be able to do this. and I do want to thank him for that. That was in 2018, and I tucked away the idea because I first of all had to complete Mediating Empire, then I wrote My Dearest Martha, and when I finished that book, I told Abby Lee I'd come across this album, but I thought it would be too ambitious to do a book, but she was surprisingly encouraging about the idea. I sent her a few shots of the images, a very rough outline, and to my amazement, she said, in principle, the press were interested. It was then that a number of things fell into place. First of all, I found out about Henrietta's background. Her father, John Bacon, was one of the most celebrated sculptors of his day. He did massive, rather grandiose sculptures, including one of Pitt the Elder, which you can see in Westminster Abbey, which is about 20 feet tall. He's now not so highly regarded, but at that time, he was well regarded. And then Henrietta's father, Charles, had been Clerk of the Works for Westminster Palace, a huge rambling expanse, because that was before the Houses of Parliament or Westminster burnt down, and they lived just in the shadow of it. And they stayed there even after Henrietta's father, Charles, died, which he did when Henrietta was only 6 years old. I then contacted Mark Whitaker, a descendant of the Bacons, who manages the Bacon website. And he said, well, there are letters of hers in an archive in New Brunswick, letters to an uncle. They very kindly sent me typed versions of the letters, and they showed that Henrietta's sister, Emma, and her mother had come out to China in 1846 and had lived with the Alcocks until after Henrietta's death. And although there were just 3 letters, they were long letters and gave a wonderful description of their life in China and of the family generally. I then discovered that Matthew Norman had just completed a PhD on John Bacon Jr., that is Henrietta's half-uncle, who himself was a well-known sculptor, but also a very good portrait painter. Matthew, like so many people, was incredibly generous with his knowledge, and he let me have all his notes, relevant notes, including those of Charles Bacon's diary, which was in the British Library, and which gave a very good picture of his life when Henrietta was growing up, even though he did die young. Then through Matthew, I met John Berry. I'm not sure whether John is here today. I think he thought he is. Yes, he is. Oh, sorry, John. Another Bacon descendant. And now John holds many of the Bacon works, many of the portraits, including this delightful sketch of Henrietta's father, Charles. He looks in this picture like a dashing Regency buck, which he probably was, although he was also quite religious. And his diary shows he had a very good relationship with Henrietta. She would accompany him when he went out sketching. Just at this time, Robert Morton was writing a biography of Rutherford Alcock. And now that's just about to be published by Paul Norbury through the Amsterdam University Press. Robert, like the others, was incredibly generous, shared all his notes that he had taken at the Westminster Archive, where Henrietta's papers, such as they are, were held. So the picture was beginning to come together. And then when I was telling my daughter, Diana, about this on the phone, she started Googling, as daughters do. And then she said to me, Dad, you do realize there are Henrietta's letters in the Cambridge archives. So I was extremely embarrassed that I hadn't discovered this, but she was right. There were 10 wonderful letters from Henrietta to Harry Parkes, the young consular official who had been working for Rutherford and who was effectively a surrogate son to Henrietta. And so I got writing. But although I was making good progress on the background, I could say very little about the paintings because despite the captions, it wasn't clear where many of them had been done and what they depicted. And that brought in Patrick Connor, sitting at the front here, one of the preeminent authorities on China Coast painting, long associated with the Martin Gregory Gallery. Diffidently, I asked Patrick if he might be interested in helping, and he was extremely enthusiastic, and without his contribution, the book certainly couldn't have materialized. He began by digitizing all 100 or so images, told me a lot about them from his own knowledge, and agreed to write an introduction setting Henrietta in the context as an amateur Western woman painter in China. But still there was the problem in identifying the locations for at least 40 sketches, which had been done during trips to the Shanghai Hills, which the Alcocks had made between 1848 and 1850. And here's an example. You'll see the caption, "From the boat en route for the hills, November 1848. So it was clear that they had gone there by boat. And in fact, one of Emma's letters referred to them acquiring or using a boat. And that gave an idea of what sort of trips were. Here we see entrance to King en route for the hills. So that's going into a canal or river on their way to the hills. We then have a leaning pagoda at, forgive my pronunciation, Shaoxiangshan. What I discovered was a famous site in China, but obviously at that point didn't mean anything to me. And here we have grave of a Mandarin at Wangshan. These were the sort of pictures which Henrietta was doing when they made these trips to the hills. But I was at a loss as to how I could find out exactly where they were, because plainly this is all built over now and just forms part of Shanghai. It's about 30 miles southwest of Shanghai. Enter Terry Chung, sitting here in the front, newly arrived in London from Hong Kong and now working as a consultant to Martin. In the most painstaking research, she tracked down these locations, and she has produced a wonderful map in the book and a detailed glossary explaining where the places were. That's no mean task, given the fact that the English names bore no relation often to the Chinese names of the time, and the Chinese names of the time bear little relation often to the Chinese names now. But she, with excellent sleuthing technique, managed that. But there was still one further problem, and that was that given the distance from the settlement, it was clear the Alcocks must have stayed overnight when making these journeys. And on the face of it, this was in breach of the travel restrictions, which restricted Westerners from making more than a day's journey. You had to be back in Shanghai or in the treaty port before midnight. Plainly, the Alcocks had spent considerably longer away. Now, Alcock, I knew, had been very strict about enforcing this rule. Another of my forebears, Walter Medhurst, had, it seems, been about to violate the restriction, and in the course of that expedition was attacked by local people, and he had got a rap over the knuckles from Alcock because he was pushing the boundaries. And so it was highly unlikely Alcock had started violating the regulations. But alongside the private papers. There were, of course, the voluminous papers in the National Archives of Kew of Alcock's correspondence. And brevity was certainly not one of Alcock's attributes. And so there were very lengthy, hundreds of pages of documents of his correspondence with Sir George Bonham, the Minister Plenipotentiary in Hong Kong. So I had to trawl through that material and found by chance that in April 1848, he had obtained permission from the local Chinese official to make an exploratory tour to the hills, including staying overnight. And he seems to have interpreted this permission as extending to further visits later that year and the following 2 years. And it's clear that following his example, many other Westerners started making those trips. Eventually, Alcock suggested to the official that maybe the arrangement could be formalized, to which the official said, well, that would not be a good idea, because that would require him to seek permission from the court in Peking, and they would undoubtedly refuse permission. And so it continued with the official with whom Alcock got on well, prepared to turn a blind eye, and Alcock and the Westerners making their trips there. So we have a large number of these images of those trips. And apart from giving us an excellent idea of what the expeditions entailed, the pictures show how Henrietta was developing her confidence. She was happy to be seen out sketching. Here we see her sketching local people, which you have to remember, for them, seeing a Western woman out with a sketchbook was quite extraordinary. She must have been here possibly on rather like the bridge we see in front of us, sitting on the bridge or maybe on the side there doing this sketch. And she was also developing her style, and we see in the next, whoops, sorry, go back. In this image, you'll see the caption, Chinese cottage in wood, Shoshan. What you've got here is the English picturesque style, which had been popularized by William Gilpin, but which so many amateur artists were adopting. And here, Henrietta is taking that English style and incorporating it into the Chinese landscape. However, it's clear that the Alcocks stopped going to the hills because the dates on the captions ran out in 1850. But we do have one final picture where you'll see at the hills, Shanghai, the last trip before the death of Henrietta Mary Bacon, using her maiden name, at Shanghai on the 11th of March, 1853. So the caption is tantalizingly vague about when this picture was done. Again, quite a picturesque view, but my guess it was November 1850, because shortly after that, there was a change in the local intendant, and the incoming intendant didn't get on at all well with Alcock. Alcock didn't get on with him. And I think Alcock decided that he could not continue with these expeditions, although the Westerners did. What's also tantalizing is that we have no idea, unless somebody's able to come up with a suggestion as to what caused Henrietta's death. No indication in the papers that she had been ill. And in fact, she was one of the few people who seemed to enjoy really good health. So it's a real puzzle. But she did. What we do know is the date of death. And what I was going to say is we also know that she was buried in the Shandong Road Cemetery, but we know that she wasn't. And I'll tell you how we found out she was, in fact, buried. She was buried there to begin with, there's no doubt about that. But Robert Morton and I had been exchanging information generally, and I said to him that he might find some useful material in correspondence between Alcock and the director of Kew Gardens, because I knew Alcock was keen on gardens, just as Henrietta was. And he said, oh, that's a good idea. And then I got a very excited email back from him saying, guess what? Henrietta's buried in Highgate Cemetery. And the reason he was able to find that out was there was a letter from Alcock to the director at Kew asking him to plant 2 trees that he had from Kew Gardens beside Henrietta's grave in Highgate Cemetery. And here we see her gravestone in the cemetery. There is no plaque on the grave now, so nobody knew, I think nobody knew that she was buried there. But fortunately, the Highgate Cemetery records record her being buried there 2 years or 2.5 years after she died in September 1855. And again, incredibly luckily, an antiquarian, a Victorian antiquarian, had recorded all the inscriptions on the gravestones in the Camden cemeteries, which included all the Highgate Cemetery inscriptions. And so we have the inscription which was on her gravestone, which you can read in the book. And so we know that she was exhumed, and then she in fact was brought back when in the same ship that her mother and Emma, her sister, came back to England in a rather macabre idea as they accompanied her remains, and she was then buried in the cemetery. And Alcock came back later, and he and Emma's mother all would have visited the grave, and the grave would have been just slightly to the left-hand side. Alison said she's going to go and visit it. I visited it. It's easy to find. I was reprimanded for trying to peel away a bit of moss from the grave. I was told that I'd have to get the permission of the family before I did any cleaning up of the grave. But it's well worth a visit. So that short summary shows how much the project owes to all those people. But underlying the project are 2 more. First of all, my former supervisor, Robert Bickers, who may well be listening in on Zoom, just back from Hong Kong, he courageously took me on as a PhD student in 2012 and has guided me through all my work, encouraging and chastising me, always with a good sense of humor and always with a light touch, and kindly agreeing to provide a foreword to the book. So many thanks, Robert. Over the years, he has squirreled away a lot of precious material, which he would then drip feed to me from time to time. And when I was writing this book, he sent me out of the blue a wonderful, I think about 100-page typescript of a diary not published by a tea taster called James Dow, who was in Shanghai at the same time as Henrietta, and writes about going to a dance or going to a ball and dancing with the consul's lady, as he calls her, and also dancing with my great-great-grandmother, Eliza Hillier. They were all at the same party together. So it's a way of showing how this sort of material can bring to life this treaty port life at such an early stage. Finally, to the publishers, City University of Hong Kong Press, who have produced, I think everybody would agree, a most beautiful book. Abby took it on first and then moved on to other projects, and Sydney Stonner has guided it through. By no means an easy task, given the interweaving of the text through the images, but she also read it with immense care and spotted all too many slips that I had made, but which can easily occur. And I know she's been backed up by a great team. They won't be on the Zoom because they're all in bed tonight, but I know they'll be looking at the recording afterwards. And so I'm here thanking them very much for a fantastic contribution and effort in producing this book. So very briefly, why should anyone be interested in Henrietta? Why should you buy the book? 3 reasons. The pictures are obviously attractive in themselves, and in terms of subject matter, they are of great interest. Some are by Rutherford, but most of them are by Henrietta. And in terms of quality, the best, I think, can compete with amateur artists like William Gilpin. But that wouldn't justify a book, because we all know that the early Victorians produced pictures like this quite often, certainly in England. It's what they depict which is key. As we've seen, they show both the official and the intimate side of consular life right at the start of the British presence in a way that has not been conveyed at all. It's before photography. There are some letters, but you need the images really to bring out what it was like, the sort of conditions they had to put up with and that families had to put up with, and the haphazard way in which Britain first established its presence. It does look idyllic in some of the images, but when you link them to the official reports of what was going on, you realize how challenging this was. In Fuzhou, for much of the time, the Alcocks were the only Western family in the treaty port, and Henrietta the only Western woman. And as I said, she spent much of the time restoring the building to make it habitable and creating a beautiful garden around it. In Shanghai, for the first 3 years, they lived in a rambling, dilapidated house in the Chinese city. When they arrived, there wasn't even a staircase to the upper floor, and there was no glass in the windows. They refurbished it and made it habitable. As you see here in this picture, this is the drawing room of the consulate. It has Western furniture, but you'll see wonderful, elaborate Chinese woodwork in the beams and the uprights, and you can see the windows as well, I think possibly having bottled glass in them. And although it was quite challenging, Henrietta was tremendously admiring of the Chinese skill in woodwork, and she undoubtedly loved this sort of interior. So these images provided a unique view of early consulate life. But while those images would be of great interest, even if they had been done by a man, the fact that they're done by a woman gives them an extra significance. We know very little about Western women in Treaty Port China in these early days. And these pictures, together with Henrietta's correspondence, provide an excellent snapshot, not just of her life, the life of her sister Emma and of her mother, but also of other women who were particularly in Shanghai and how they were coping with this totally new way of life. It's a feminine perspective, which is highly unusual for the time. But what is really unusual is the fact that Henrietta was able to get out and depict the ordinary Chinese people here. You have to imagine them looking at this Western woman. For a middle-class Chinese woman to go out, she always had to be chaperoned. The idea for them of seeing a Western woman sitting on the bank, sketching, no doubt Rutherford was in the vicinity, but would have been quite extraordinary. And what they show, therefore, is the way in which Western families and their practices implicitly legitimized and extended the British presence in the very earliest days. Although it seems benign and fairly innocuous, it was a way in which the British presence would slowly erode the restrictions and erode Chinese sovereignty over these years in a way which would build up resentment about that presence. And finally, the book provides an intimate portrait of a marriage and of a marriage performed in the consular setting. I have no doubt it was congenial, as Mitchie said, and companionate. Alcock was an extremely interesting man, if sometimes a bit of a bore. But he obviously adored Henrietta. And she, I think, was fascinating. She's highly literate. She would write poetry. She wrote a prologue to a play that was performed in the theatre. She was very amusing, if also religiously devout, full of energy and enthusiasm, a traveller, a gardener, a homemaker, and a mother figure for the young consular officials who found themselves out in China, many of whom fell ill when they were there. And also, of course, an artist willing to go out into the countryside. And what the book shows is how she and Rutherford, between them, used their painting to share their life together. And Henrietta wasn't afraid to share the intimate side of her life. This was a picture she enclosed with a letter to her uncle. He was a clergyman in Canada, which at that time for the Victorians may have been quite surprising. So in her way, I think she was quite a modern woman. Sadly, we hardly know what she looked like. We are left only, with this picture, done by Rutherford at Fuzhou, as she stands in her evening gown, looking out at the sunset. But it's just enough, I think, to be able to conjure up her life with Rutherford, and her life as a woman in Treaty Port, China, in the very earliest days. So, thank you.
Very much.
Yes, yes.
Well, I'll start off. I was just wondering if, I mean, I found her drawing really very good. I mean, she's a talented artist. And I mean, obviously she had the genes somewhere, but do you think she was trained formally by her uncle, or you mentioned him?
I don't think so. The amount of contact she had with her uncle, John, I think was very limited. There's not much indication. He had retired to the country at that. And I think if they'd had contact, it would have filtered through, in particular, for example, her father's diary would have made more mention. But she undoubtedly, I mean, I know it's very early on, but she undoubtedly went out with her father. She saw him sketching, and I'm sure she started sketching then. And she had his sketchbooks. John Berry has got those sketchbooks. In fact, very kindly let me have a picture. When they were building the church in Shanghai, they wanted to have a Gothic window, and so they used the sketchbooks where Charles had done a sketch of a Gothic window. John, let me have a copy. It's in the book. And I think Henrietta would have seen his sketches. She may well have done some to use that. And certainly it was an inspiration. So many of these people did, I mean, girls, when they were, at home, they either had a governess who would teach them sketching. So I think nothing more formal than that, though, really.
I was very impressed by
Yes, yes.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, those trips would have been day trips, would have been able to come back to the back before 1860. 1860, then it all changed. Or, right, interestingly, subject to passport system. The passport system that applied to all everyone, including it. And so Marjorie, who was killed on the border, he had a passport which actually did not properly authorize what he was doing. That was a slightly different system. But certainly, for you're right, I think increasingly West in Shanghai Hills, Berkeley, another person, fortune. But he did it. He went out France. He did it very much as a disapproval. He tried to keep it enforce it certainly until mid-18th.
Yes. Just ask you to come back.
Yes, sorry.
People online.
Oh.
That's fine. So,
I know the answer to that because she says in a letter that it's too difficult to learn Chinese because when she was in Fuzhou, there was a dialect which was even more difficult. And so she thought it really wasn't worth trying. So she says, I picked up enough to be able to give instructions to the builders about what needs to be done, what needs to be repaired, and to the other servants. Alcock obviously spoke quite a lot of Chinese. He didn't speak it as well as quite a few of the diplomats did. He needed a bit of help. In terms of mixing with the Chinese, she didn't in Fuzhou, but interestingly, there's a letter from Emma which talks about them then going to have tea with the Chinese intendant, the Dao Tai, and him then returning to them. So they did have some contact like that with one of them, the one that Alcock got on well with, who gave the permission. I think they had quite a lot of interaction with him, but that was fairly exceptional. And apart from them, she wouldn't have had any contact other than with servants and the like. But not the Chinese middle-class Chinese women weren't allowed out other than chaperoned, and so having any contact with them at the time was extremely difficult. There is a sense, but it's that she's not lonely. She specifically says when she's in Fuzhou, because when she goes out, I haven't mentioned this, is in the book. She goes out with a Mrs. Bradley, who is her lady in waiting, or lady's maid rather, lady's maid. But poor Mrs. Bradley really wasn't expecting life as it turned out to be. And so she went home. And so Henrietta says, I'm now the only woman here. But she says, it's so beautiful here. that I really am not complaining. Good relationship with Rutherford, very good relationship with Parkes, who was there with her as a young consular official, and they would go out on their sketching expedition. And somebody she was obviously self-sufficient intellectually. She was obviously writing quite a lot. But then I think she was glad when it came to an end and they then moved to Shanghai. And so there was more contact there were some Western women there. And of course, Emma and her mother came out in early 46. And that was obviously a tremendous, she got on very well with both of them. And that was key to it as well.
I was just going to ask you one thing. Was he a member of the RAS Shanghai? Northern Straits, yes, Rutherford. Someone mentioned that to me. No,
well, he left Shanghai in 54, 50,
oh, right. Okay.
55.
58.
Yeah, and because he went, you see, he went first to Canton and then he went, as Jim has said, to Japan. So we could find out.
No, someone mentioned it, and it just sort of crossed my mind. Yeah. Connection. I'll look at it. Right. Well, I think we will say thank you very much, and I'd like to point everyone in the direction of the books for sale. Okay, and come and join us for another drink, and I will go get. Thank you very much.
I should actually have thanked Rory for coming here, who's doing the necessary with the books.